Hello, I'm Richard Peña, a professor of film studies at Columbia University, and I'm here at the Quad Cinema in New York City for the Cohen Media Channel to discuss a wonderful sampler program they've put together on world cinema in the 1990s for very interesting and all quite different films. What brings these films together? Why do we have these films in one set? Perhaps someday we'll look back and we'll call this set the cinema before digital, because in fact the 1990s was that decade that really witnessed a transition from photochemical filmmaking to electronic filmmaking, digital filmmaking. It was really during the 1990s that everything from online editing to digital cameras to finally digital projectors really not only entered into the field but became standardized and eventually came to dominate the field. But these are films that are still made photochemically. These are still films that use cameras, were made in kind of the traditional way. Some of them might have been perhaps edited at least partially in a digital format, but generally speaking, we're still talking about the older style of filmmaking here. So what changed with the coming of digital? That's still being debated because, of course, things are changing all the time. Certainly, digital cinema made cameras even lighter. The possibility of filming in all kinds of situations even greater. A lot of different things like that. In a sense, it perhaps made cinema less of a kind of spectacle in a way, and something a little more intimate, because it was something now that we could watch not just in movie theaters or even in our home, but on our computers, on our iPads, for some people even on their telephone. So because of that, cinema kind of began to change its character, and I still don't know where we're going to come out from that, but certainly digital has affected every single aspect of cinema as we know it. But these are films from that moment right before these great changes began to really assert themselves in the field of filmmaking. The first film that I want to talk about is the film A Single Girl by Benoit Jacquot. This was really the film that marked Benoit Jacquot, I should say made Benoit Jacquot into a kind of international figure. He had been working since the mid-1970s after having a stint as being an assistant to Marguerite Duras, and had made a number of considerable films. But it was really with A Single Girl that not only was the film extremely well received in France, but became a big hit in many other parts of the world. Here in the United States, it had a certain amount of play, showed in movie theaters, and was certainly very, very well reviewed. The first thing to note about the film is it's that rare film that's shot in real time. That means that there are no ellipses in the film. The space between shots doesn't really exist. In other words, one shot ends and the next shot begins the exact second after the shot before it ended. So we never feel, as we often do in films, that there is, for example, a space between when a character enters into a building and perhaps sits down in her office or something like that. All of that time is included. There are no chunks of people's lives that are taken out to make the action move more smoothly. This strategy, I think, works perfectly for the film because, as you'll see, it's about a young woman, beautifully played by Virginie Ledoyen, and this was really her breakthrough film as well, who in the course of a few hours has to make some fairly momentous decisions about her life. So from the moment the film begins, we're really with her at every step of the way. We feel every change that goes on for her, every encounter she has with her co-workers, every argument she has with her boyfriend, every job that she has to do in the hotel where she works. All of these things become really viscerally communicated to us, and we know at the same time that in her mind is going on this process of decision making. So again, it's a very intense film, one that really brings us very closely into the life of this character, and as such, I think was seen as an important film because it gave a focus on a young woman, she's probably in her mid-20s or whatever, that we normally hadn't seen, one that is emotional and at the same time quite physical at the same time. We really feel the sense of the presence of this woman in the world. It's a beautiful film, and perhaps of all the films that we have here, maybe along with the film The Wind Will Carry Us, the one that perhaps anticipates the digital era, because the kind of camera movement, the kind of physical proximity that we get to the character is something that will become even more, one could say, familiar during the digital era. The second film I want to discuss is Queen Margot, La Reine Margot, directed by Patrice Chéreau. This is based on an Alexandre Dumas novel that had previously been brought to cinema, and in fact the story is quite popular. It's centered around the events of what was called the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, which, for those of you who know your French history, will know that it's a time when thousands of French Protestants were slaughtered in France during a time when there was a kind of war going on between especially the sort of Catholic nobility and the Protestant aristocracy in France. The film is full of intrigues, betrayals, false marriages, clandestine love affairs, a real swashbuckler in every way. But what Patrice Chéreau brings to this material is, again, a kind of wonderful physicality and immediacy. Normally with period films, the directors try and create a sense of distance. We're looking at the past. We're looking at several centuries ago. This is a film that really brings us up close and personal to all of these characters. One can almost smell their surroundings in a way. One feels so close to them. There's a sense in which when these characters have sex or they fight, you feel the physicality in all of those different actions. So Chéreau makes a kind of somewhat dusty French classic, literary classic, into a real vibrant, living piece of cinema. And that's, I think, one of the great achievements here. He takes a story that's set centuries ago and makes it not only vital, but feel very contemporary at the same time. We establish a kind of closeness to these characters that's somewhat unexpected in a period film. A very beautiful work that I know you'll enjoy. The next film I want to talk about that's part of the set is the film Van Gogh by Maurice Pialat. Another period film, but one that couldn't be more different. Pialat's intention is not necessarily to make us feel up close and personal to these characters. It's much more a meditative work on the status of the artist and perhaps the changing status of the artist in the 19th century, when increasingly the question of the marketplace and marketability came to dominate so much discussions of especially visual art at that moment. And he sort of centers on Van Gogh as that figure who marked that transition, an unquestionable genius who was a economic and sales failure in his time. One can't help but feel that there's a certain self-reflection going on in the film at the same time. Pialat himself not only started as a painter, he was actually, I think, a quite impressive painter before he began to dedicate himself to photography and film, but more than that, I think it's about the artist being caught up in the machinery of commerce, something that for a filmmaker would perhaps be even a more familiar theme than it might have been for a painter at that time. Again, the relationship between especially Van Gogh and Dr. Gachet, the man who supported him for so many years, becomes a sort of mirror for Pialat's own relationship, often very troubled relationship, with the producers with whom he worked over many years. As opposed to Queen Margot, this is much more of a kind of contemplative, more cerebral film in a certain way. Although I think all the period detail is excellently done, that's not Pialat's point. He doesn't want to bring us into Van Gogh's world, but he does want to show us how Van Gogh represented a real change in the notion of artist in Western culture. The last film that we have is not a film that is from France, but a film by someone who certainly was supported by France throughout his career, and that is The Wind Will Carry Us by the late, great Abbas Kiarostami. Abbas Kiarostami was, of course, a filmmaker from Iran and was the leading exponent of that wonderful explosion, emergence of Iranian cinema that began in the late 1980s. He was really the filmmaker more than anyone else who brought Iranian cinema to the rest of the world. And as such, during his lifetime, I think there was really almost no one who produced a body of work in the last 20, 30 years that can compare to that of Kiarostami. This was actually his last celluloid film, his last photochemical film. And I remember talking to Kiarostami at that time and him telling me he had just begun working with digital cameras and was sure he would never shoot anything again on celluloid. He was really so taken with it. So right after that, he began to make films like ABC Africa and 10 and other films like that, all shot digitally. But this is a film that he made on celluloid, and it not only ends the century, it was made in 1999, but ends that particular phase of Kiarostami's career. The story itself deals with a group of filmmakers, although they kind of pose a little bit as scientists in a way, who go out to a remote Kurdish village in that part of Iran that's populated by Kurdish people to film what has been reputed to be a very rare kind of funeral service that the Kurdish people undertake when one of their village elders dies. And in this case, it's an old woman who they have learned is on the verge of death, so they rush out there from Tehran with cameras and other material to try and record the death and then, of course, the ceremony that follows. But when they get there, the woman somehow refuses to die, or at least won't die. We never really see her. She continues to be living, and everyone in the town continues to offer what they can to prolong her life. And meanwhile, the filmmakers have to figure out what they're doing in this town, what their relationship is, not only to the town itself, but to this act. Why do they want to film it? What does it mean to film it? As always, in Kiarostami, the dramatic action is a pretense for a kind of meditation on different issues. In this particular case, not only the connection between different peoples, different classes, but what the role of artist is in society. What does it mean to record a ceremony? Why would you record the ceremony? So many issues like that. There's a kind of fascinating discourse that goes on in the film also about technology and the relationship in which media technology not only opens us up to the world, but closes us down to it at the same time. It becomes its own end in a way, recording as a substitution, if you will, for the experience of the world. It's a tremendously profound work. The title is taken from a poem by Farrukh Farrokhzad, one of Iran's greatest modern poets, The Wind Will Carry Us, and a female poet who continues to be enormously popular in Iran. For me, it was Kiarostami's masterpiece. He continued to make films for the rest of his life, several films that were really quite interesting, but somehow he really put it all in this film. This was the film that I think was the most brilliant possible exposition of his thought, revelation of what he thought about cinema. And he himself actually mentioned that several times, and in the last part of his life spent at least as much of his artistic energy making photographs and installations and directing operas and doing other kinds of things. I think partially he felt that he had done what he could in the medium of cinema with this film. Really one of the great masterpieces of the 1990s. In fact, this whole program is made up of, I think, very important films. So looking at these four, you'll get a good sense of not only the achievements, but what the high points and various approaches to filmmaking were in this particular decade, a decade that now, of course, seems to us like not only the end of the century, but the end of cinema as we knew it for so many years. I'm Richard Peña. I'm from Columbia University, and for the Cohen Media Channel, please enjoy the show.